Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The snow fell with the slowness of grief, as if each flake carried the weight of a silence no one dared break. Moscow, that evening, seemed held in an icy breath, frozen in a stillness that resembled a collective mourning. The shining avenues, the golden domes, the silhouettes huddled in their wool coats. Everything seemed distant, almost unreal, as if seen through a misted window. And in this frozen theater, Alexei Vronsky walked like a shadow among men. He was one of those whose name makes markets tremble and bankers bow. His fortune had been built on steel, oil, and contracts signed at midnight, in glass towers where the world silently decides. But power had been no match for what fate had wrested from him. Natalia, the love of his youth, who died 2 winters earlier in an accident as brutal as it was absurd. Since that day, everything in him had gone out. His gaze, once hard but alive, had faded like an ember forgotten beneath the snow. His movements had become mechanical. He ate because he had to. He worked because the world still expected him to lead. But he was no longer living. He wandered, locked in the cold luxury of his Arbat Street mansion, among the frozen portraits of a woman who would never return. There was only one thing left in his life that could anchor him to reality: the daughter, Katya, a 5-year-old girl with black bangs and cloudy gray eyes. Katya hadn't really been a child since that fateful day. She no longer played. She no longer laughed. She barely spoke, responding only with nods or brief glances. She seemed suspended in her mother's absence, trapped in a world her father could no longer reach. They lived side by side in the same house, but separated by an invisible wall, that of unspoken pain. That evening, a January evening when the cold seemed to want to bite into his soul, Alexei felt a strange impulse, a profound fatigue, mixed with a nameless dissatisfaction. He watched his daughter, sitting in front of an empty plate, her gaze lost in space, and something inside him cracked. Without thinking, he put a coat on her, grabbed her own, and took her into the city, as one flees a silence that has become too heavy. He walked aimlessly until his steps led him to a small shop front he had never noticed before, although he often passed by this street. A discreet sign, in slightly faded white letters: Winter Light, Lumiere de Hiver. He pushed the door open. Inside, a simple warmth immediately enveloped them. It wasn't the luxury he was used to, but another kind of warmth, more human. The walls were covered with sepia photographs, unknown families, faces from the past, smiling soldiers, red-cheeked children. The tables were small, the tablecloths embroidered, the windows covered with frost. And in the air hung the scent of dill, hot soup, and memories. A world opposite to his own. That's where he saw her. Alyona Petrova. Thin, almost frail, her hair hastily tied, a speck of flour on the corner of her forehead. She wore an old sky blue shawl, faded by the years, but inexplicably soft. Her hands, damaged by washing and winters, nevertheless seemed endowed with a natural care. There was in her way of moving a discreet grace, like that of a woman who does not seek to be seen, but whom one cannot help but notice. When she approached their table, she didn't look at Alexei first, but Katya. She knelt gently, without saying a word, and waited for the child to turn her head. Katya didn't. Then, with patient calm, Alyona murmured something barely audible, perhaps a word of welcome or a simple melody. Then she held out a small spoonful of hot soup to the girl, with a smile so sweet, so genuine, that it seemed to come from another time. And Katya slowly opened her mouth. Alexei felt dizzy. He felt his heart, long frozen in a shell of silence, crack like ice under the first ray of sunlight. It wasn't just the gesture. It was the presence of this woman, as if she understood, without asking questions. As if she too had known this silent abyss, this life suspended in an absence. He said nothing. He just watched. And the next day he came back. And again the day after that. As the days passed, a thin thread was woven between them, invisible, but solid. Alyona wasn't pushy. She didn't ask questions, but she always remembered what Katya liked. She brought the dishes with the same tenderness, served them with the same attention as if they were her own family. One evening, when he had stayed later, Alexei dared to ask him, in a voice almost choked with emotion, Do you have children? She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. I had a daughter. Masha. She died at 4. Leukemia. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. Her voice was neither bitter nor dramatic. Simple. Naked. His father couldn't take it. He left. I carried on. As best I could. Now I serve food, and sometimes I recognize that emptiness in the children's eyes. So I do what I can. And she shrugged her shoulders humbly, as if all this were just an ordinary fact. But Alexei, that evening, returning home with Katya asleep against his shoulder, understood something essential. It wasn't money or power that would bring life back into their home. It was presence, attention, and perhaps the quiet love of a woman who had also gone through the winter of grief. One evening, when the restaurant was almost empty, bathed in a flickering golden light, and the snow was beginning to fall again like a silent veil on the streets of Moscow, Alexei, his fingers clenched around his cup of black tea, looked at her for a long time. There was a peaceful slowness in Aliona's gestures, an almost sacred care, as if every object she touched became worthy of attention. And that evening, without really knowing why, perhaps because he was fed up with his own silence, he dared to ask a question he had never asked aloud. How do you manage not to hate life? His voice was hoarse, as if the words had clashed with years of bitterness before they came out. Aliona looked up at him, and his gaze held neither surprise nor pity, just shared knowledge. She sat down gently opposite him on the edge of the bench, her hands clasped in her lap. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the steamy windows, the shadows dancing on the walls, then closed her eyes for a moment. Because every morning, I wake up thinking that maybe, somewhere, a child will need me to give them a spoonful of soup with love. It's not much, but it's what I still have to offer. She said this without grandiloquence, without trying to impress, like a truth too simple to be embellished. A truth that one only truly understands when one has lost everything. Alexei felt a burning behind his eyes. It wasn't sadness. It was older than that. Deeper. Like a dam you never thought you could break. It was at that precise moment that Katya, who had been silently drawing at the table, stood up without a word. Her small footsteps echoed in the quiet room. She approached Aliona and hugged her. For a long time. Without fear. Without embarrassment. As if answering everything the adults couldn't say. Aliona closed her arms around the child, her eyes moist but her smile intact. The months passed, and with them the slow transformation of morning. Spring returned to Moscow with its white light, almost timid, as if it too were afraid of disturbing others. But he was no longer alone in Alexei's heart. He was welcomed. Katya spoke now, not often, but confidently. She laughed. She asked questions, touched things, sometimes hummed forgotten Russian lullabies that only Aliona seemed to know. Each burst of laughter from his daughter was a stone breaking away from the monument of pain he had built inside himself. But love wasn't simple. Not when you're a man made of walls, secrets, contracts, and silences. Alexei watched Aliona with a new fear. Not that of losing her. He knew that vertigo only too well, but that of hurting her, of loving badly, of betraying Natalia by loving again. He felt guilty for watching Aliona's silhouette, for becoming attached to her voice, to her calm presence. He was ashamed to feel this strange peace in her presence. And above all, he dreaded the world's gaze. Judgment. The irony of the elite. What would people say in the hushed circles where he moved? That a man of his rank had lost his head over a waitress? One evening, in painful awkwardness, he tried to put words to this tumult. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm lost. I tell myself I don't have the right, not the right to love again. And then, you're different. Simple. And me? I come from a cold world. You have no idea what that's like. He stopped there, ashamed, like a child caught in a mistake. But Aliona, without being disturbed, gently placed her hand on his. I didn't come to replace anyone, and I don't want anything you wouldn't give. But your daughter, she's already adopted me, and your silence doesn't scare me. I'm not trying to enter your world. I'm just reaching out if you want to leave yours. That evening, he didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. A year later, a photograph appeared in a discreet, almost confidential newspaper, in a section that few read. It showed Alexei Vronsky, usually so serious, so distant, walking hand in hand with an unknown woman, in a pale gray coat and blue shawl, with a little girl between them laughing heartily. Some in the gilded salons of Moscow murmured. There was talk of madness, of passing madness, of discreet scandal. But in the heart of this man once frozen by loss, the snow had finally melted. Slowly, deeply. And it all began one winter evening, in a small restaurant with embroidered tablecloths, when a broken but still loving woman offered a spoonful of soup to a silent child, as if it were her own.